Have you ever seen a barn find in Forza Horizon 6 and wondered how the process would look like in real life? Because the way the game does it, you kind of just find a car and then sort of just get to keep it, that's it. So while making this video, I wanted to answer three main questions. 1. Are barn finds even real? Does that sort of thing happen in real life? 2. If they are real, what's the process like? What happens between finding a car to then getting to keep it? And 3. How much would all of this cost? The repairs for the car, the paperwork, any other legal processes that I'm currently unaware of? Let's get into it. So, are barn finds even real? Yes, they absolutely are, just not in the way that the game might present. The most famous case is probably that of the Bayonne collection. This happened in France in 2014. A guy called Roger Bayonne, who was a shipping magnate, had spent the 50s and 60s collecting some of the rarest classic cars in Europe. See, he planned to open a museum with them, right? But then the 70s came and his business kinda just fell apart, which, as you'd expect, threw this plan right down the drain. But here's what's interesting, right? Instead of selling those cars, he parked like 60 of them under a roof in his estate and just left them there. And that's where they stayed for 40 years. Now Roger's family, they knew that the cars were there, but since so much time had passed, no one really knew what was in the collection anymore. Roger had passed away by this point, and his son was quietly maintaining the estate without ever really taking an inventory of what he had. So when the family finally decided to bring in some auctioneers, thinking that maybe they'd find a few decent classics that were worth selling, what they actually found was completely insane. The guys from the auction literally had to walk on the roofs of some of the cars to get to the others simply because of how tightly they were packed. And under a pile of magazines, they found a Ferrari 250 GT California Spider that used to belong to the French actor Alain Delon. That one car sold at the auction for about 16 million euros, with the entire collection coming at a total of about 25. Then there's another case of the Bugatti Type 57S. This one's kind of a similar story. A British doctor called Harold, and get this, Carr, bought a 1937 Type 57S Atlante, which is one of only 17 ever made with that specific bodywork. He drove it for a few years, and then in 1960 he kind of just parked it in his garage and then never touched it again. Nearly 50 years after he died, his nephew found it while clearing the garage out. It went to auction in 2009 and sold for about $4.4 million. And later in 2020, after being restored, it went for over 10 million. So yes, barn finds are 100% real. Rare forgotten cars do get discovered in barns, garages, lockups all the time, so that part from Forza definitely holds up. But here's where things kinda start to stray away, because in every single one of those real barn find stories, the car ended up with someone who had an actual claim to it, not just someone random. The Bayonne collection went to Roger's family, and the Bugatti went to Dr. Carr's nephew. So these were more so inheritances, not just a random car that you find and get to keep. In Forza, you're not related to anyone. You don't own the land that the barn's on. You've never even met the person who's parked the car there. You just get a text, drive to a random spot in the woods, and the game just hands you the car. Which brings us to question 2. What actually happens between finding a car and owning it? In Forza, the whole process happens in like 2 minutes. You get to the barn, you claim the car, and either you wait for it to be restored or you pay a big fee in the menu to instantly fix it. That's it, it's yours. In real life though, in Japan, where Forza Horizon 6 is set, the process is a lot more complicated, and I'm going to walk you through it step by step. Before we do that though, we need to pick an example car first. So what better option than the Toyota 2000 GT, the car that basically put Japanese sports cars on the map. So step 1, actually finding the car, this part does hold up. Real Japanese barn finds do happen. There's a decent JDM scene of people documenting abandoned Skylines, Supras, NSXs sitting in mountain garages and old car parks. So the discovery part is realistic. Step 2 though? This is where things start falling apart. Because contrary to what Forza may have you believe, surprise surprise, you can't just take the car. In Japan, an abandoned car is legally still someone's property. It doesn't matter if it's been sitting in a barn for 40 years covered in dust. Under the Japanese civil code, a car is treated as someone else's asset. And so taking it without their permission is basically theft. And here's the crazy part, right? Even if, say, you're the landowner of the property that the barn is on, you still don't get the car. You can't even get rid of it, by the way, it just needs to stay there. While doing my research, I found a piece in Japan today a few years back about this exact same issue. A lawyer explained that if a car is dumped on private property, the police treat it as a civil matter and refuse to get involved. And even the property owner can't move the car themselves, because if they do, the actual legal owner can come back and sue them for damages. There's a case they mention of a Maserati worth around 8 million yen that was just left abandoned in a paid parking lot and nobody could do anything about it. So the first thing you have to do is find out who actually owns the car. But that's a whole process on its own, which brings us to step 3, tracking down the owner. Every car in Japan has a document called the Jidosha Kensasho, which is essentially the vehicle's registration document. And as you'd expect, it lists the registered owner. So in theory, whoever's name is on that document is the person that you need to find. In practice though, for a car that's been sitting in a barn for decades, this gets messy in a few different ways. First, the owner who's listed might be dead. If that's the case, the car legally passes to whoever inherits their assets, which in Japan gets handled by the inheritance administrators, and for all people who die without a will, this is its own complicated legal process. Second, the car might have been sold informally at some point, so the paperwork might not actually have been updated. And if that's the case, you'd now have to trace the chain of sales to figure out who currently owns it. And third, the paperwork might just be lost entirely. And in that case, you would have to apply to the local land transport office to reissue the certificate, which itself requires proof that you have a legitimate connection to the car in the first place, which you don't have. The article that I mentioned earlier said that in the abandoned car cases that this lawyer handled, the process of just tracking down the owner and legally moving the car takes around 30 to 45 days. And that's just for a regular family car. For a rare classic, you can expect this to be a lot higher, since the estate would want a proper valuation, potentially auction, and probably a probate court to sign off on the sale. Which brings us to step 4, actually buying it. Let's say you find the owner or the estate and they agree to sell it to you. In every single barn find case that I've found, the car went straight to auction. It wasn't a private sale, because when you're dealing with a car that could potentially be worth 7 figures, no lawyer is going to let their client privately sell it for cheap. So realistically, if a 2000 GT turned up in a Japanese barn tomorrow, you'd be bidding against every series Japanese classic cars collector on earth. And even if you do win it, you still got to transfer the ownership to your name. In Japan, that's called a Meigi Henko, a name change on the vehicle's registration document. At this stage though, you're just becoming the owner on paper. The car itself, legally, is in a status called Ichiji Masu, which means that it's temporarily deregistered. Basically, it exists, but you can't really drive it yet. Real quick before we move on, if you're enjoying this kind of breakdown, please hit the subscribe button. I do a lot of videos where I take video games way too seriously, and you subscribing generally helps me so much. But anyway, that's it. Back to the video. Moving on to step 5. We are now on the restoration process, and this is where the 2000 GT is actually a really good pick. Let me explain. For most classic cars, this process is a nightmare because parts just simply don't exist anymore. But for the 2000 GT specifically, there's a program called GR Heritage Parts, which Toyota launched in 2020. It's Toyota themselves reproducing original parts for the most iconic classics, including the 2000 GT. They are making transmission synchros, differential gears, stuff that requires them to dig out original blueprints from the 1960s and reverse engineer the parts from scratch. There's a great interview with the guy in charge as well, by the way. So for this car to actually now order these parts, Toyota makes you prove that you own the car with a registration document. You'd also want to go to a proper specialist for the actual work. There are 2 really well-known ones in Japan: Shinmei, which is Japan's oldest Toyota restoration shop, and Rocky Auto, run by a guy called Yoshiya Watanabe in Okazaki. Then comes step 6, passing the shock-in. Once your car is restored, before you can actually drive it in Japanese roads, it needs to pass something called a shock-in. which is Japan's compulsory vehicle inspection. And this inspection is one of the strictest in the world. They check emissions, brakes, alignment, headlights, suspension, chassis, everything. If your car fails a single item, you can't register. Classic cars can pass the shock-in, but for a 60-year-old car that's been sitting in a barn, you're going to need a full mechanical restoration first. And finally, step 7, registration and insurance. Once you've passed the shock-in, you can finally now re-register the car as a road vehicle, a legal plated car that you can actually now drive on Japanese roads. This is also the stage where you need something called a Shako Shomisho, a parking space certificate. You get this by proving to your local police station that you have a real legal parking spot for your car. And then there's insurance, which in Japan is basically two things. The Jibaiseki, the compulsory liability insurance, which every car legally needs and which you already had to have to pass the shock-in, and then the Nini Hoken, the voluntary comprehensive cover. Now this is technically optional, but for a car worth potentially over $1 million, let's be real here, you're gonna be getting it. And okay, finally, that's the process done from when you find the car to you getting to keep it. And so now we move on to question 3, and perhaps the most important one. How much are we spending on this thing? Let's start with the obvious one, buying the car. For the 2000 GT, we do have solid recent auction data. A regular good condition version of this car currently sells for somewhere between $830,000 to $1.1 million at auction. For a barn find example though, condition matters massively. Based on the Bugatti precedent where the barn condition car sold for about 40% of what it went after restoration, I'd estimate a barn find 2000 GT to go from around $400,000 to $600,000. So let's just take $500K as our starting number. Next up, we've got transportation and initial inspection. Getting an enclosed classic car transported from the middle of nowhere in Japan to a proper Nagoya restoration shop, plus the initial specialist assessment when it arrives, is going to be somewhere around $5,000 to $10,000. So let's add that on top. Now we get to the big one, the restoration. For a car that's been sitting in a barn for decades, you're looking at a full ground-up restoration. There's a full engine rebuild, gearbox and diff rebuild, chassis inspection and repair, interior restoration, new wiring, wheels, tires, basically everything. For a car like the 2000 GT, based on what shops like Shinmei charge for their museum grade work, and comparing to published restoration case studies from other high-end classic specialists, you're looking at a range of around $200,000 to $500,000 for a proper restoration. So let's use $300K as our estimate. Then there's the shock-in, registration, and general paperwork. The shock-in inspection itself is only around 100 to 200,000 yen, which is around $700 to $1,400. The parking space certificate is also a small fee, and adding registration and admin on top, let's take a budget for about $3,000 for all the paperwork. And finally, we've got insurance. For a car worth potentially over $1 million, you're looking at a specialist classic car cover. Agreed value policies for cars in this range typically cost between $5,000 to $15,000 a year. So let's take $8,000 for the first year. So the final number for getting your Forza Horizon Stakes Toyota 2000 GT barn find on the road is approximately $821,000. If you're in the mood for more of this kind of Forza breakdown, I did a video recently where I worked out how much the entire Horizon Festival would cost to run, which I'll put on the screen now. Otherwise, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.